She stood in the doorway of her own home and watched her husband laugh. Not at something funny, at her. 5 years of marriage, 5 years of silence, 5 years of swallowing her pride while Damian Volkov sat on his throne and called it love. And tonight, the night she came home early, the night she wasn't supposed to be there, she finally understood every single thing she had refused to see. The woman on his couch, the blanket, her mother's blanket. She didn't scream, she didn't cry. She simply decided, if this story already has you gripping your seat, you're exactly where you're supposed to be. Hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications, because this story is only just beginning, and trust me, you do not want to miss what Isabella does next. And while you're at it, drop a like and tell me in the comments, what city, what country are you watching from tonight? I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's get into it. The storm came in fast that October evening, the kind that rolled off the Atlantic without warning and turned the streets of the city into rivers of black water and blinking neon. Thunder shook the windows of the buildings downtown. The wind bent the old oaks lining the private road that led up to the Volkov estate like they were nothing more than weeds. Isabella Vane Volkov sat in the back of a hired car, watching the rain streak the glass, and thought about her mother. She thought about her often on nights like this. Her mother had loved storms, said they were the world clearing its throat, said the mess was necessary before the clean air came in. Isabella pressed her fingers together in her lap and tried to breathe evenly. She had not been planning to come home tonight. The business dinner in the city had ended abruptly. A partner's medical emergency, no one at fault, nothing dramatic. And her original plan of staying overnight in town had simply collapsed. Her assistant had offered to book her a hotel room. Isabella had said no. She said she wanted to go home. Later, she would think about that decision for a long time, about what would have happened if she had just taken the hotel room. If she had let the night pass quietly, slept in clean sheets someone else laundered, ordered room service, and returned home the following afternoon none the wiser. But she had said she wanted to go home. So home is where she went. The car turned through the iron gates of the Volkov estate. The estate sat on 4 private acres outside the city proper, a massive, severe structure of dark stone and tall windows, the kind of home that looked more like a statement than a place where people actually lived. Damian had bought it 6 years ago, before they were married, and he had made clear from the beginning that it was his name on the deed, his design choices on every floor, his rules for how guests behaved, how staff were to be addressed, which rooms were open and which were not. Isabella had decorated one room herself, a small sitting room on the east wing, 2nd floor. She had filled it with warm things, a reading chair, a lamp that cast honey-colored light, her books, and the blanket her mother had made by hand over the course of 3 long winters. Cream-colored wool, a pattern her mother had invented herself, stitched with a patience Isabella had always admired and never quite managed to inherit. That room was hers, the only thing in the entire house that truly was. She thanked the driver, stepped out into the rain with her bag pulled close, and walked through the front entrance. The house was not quiet. That was the first thing she noticed. It was nearly 10 at night, and the estate should have been still. Staff quarters were in the separate building off the east garden, and Damian's evenings, when he was not at the private club or handling organization matters downtown, were usually spent in his study or his gym. He was not a man who liked noise for the sake of it. He liked order. But there was music coming from upstairs, low, slow, deliberately chosen. Isabella stood at the base of the grand staircase and held the strap of her bag and listened to that music for exactly 3 seconds. Something moved through her chest in that moment. Not a thought exactly. More like a door closing somewhere deep inside. A lock she had not known was still open, turning. She climbed the stairs. The hallway on the 2nd floor was lit the way it always was at night. Soft wall sconces, low and amber, the kind of lighting Damian had chosen because he believed harsh light was for hospitals and interrogation rooms. She walked the length of the hall slowly, not cautiously, just slowly. Her shoes were quiet on the runner carpet. The door to her sitting room was not closed. It was open. Not all the way, just enough. Just enough that the music was clearest here, and just enough that the light from inside fell across the hallway floor in a narrow yellow bar. Isabella put her hand flat against the door and pushed it open the rest of the way. She had imagined in the 3 seconds she had stood at the bottom of the staircase a few different things she might find. A party, a private meeting, something Damien was using her space for without bothering to mention it to her, which would have been typical, which would have made her furious in a familiar, manageable way. She had not imagined this. Damien Volkov was sitting in her reading chair, her chair, the one she had brought into the marriage herself, from the apartment she'd lived in during the years before she met him. He was sitting in it like it had always been his, one leg crossed over his knee, a glass of dark whiskey balanced on the armrest. He was wearing the open-collared shirt he favored when he was trying to appear relaxed, and he looked exactly like a man who believed he was exactly where he was supposed to be. The woman beside him was seated on the ottoman. Her name, Isabella would learn quickly, was Victoria Hale. She was younger, not dramatically, but noticeably. Dark hair, expensive taste, the particular kind of confidence that comes from being told repeatedly that you are extraordinary. She was wearing a dress that had not been in any closet in this house 24 hours ago. She was wrapped in Isabella's mother's blanket. It was pulled around her shoulders like she'd reached for the nearest soft thing available and helped herself. That blanket had survived 4 cross-country moves, 2 floods, and the night Isabella sat beside her mother's hospital bed and understood for the first time that the woman who taught her everything was not going to get better. That blanket had dried tears Isabella had never shown another living person, and it was wrapped around a stranger's shoulders while her husband watched and did not move. For a moment, no one spoke. The music continued, something slow and low from the small speaker on the bookshelf, Isabella's bookshelf. Then Damien took a sip of his whiskey. "You should have called," he said. 3 words, casual, unbothered. Isabella looked at him. She looked at him the way you look at something you are memorizing because you know you will need to remember it accurately later when the emotion has cooled enough for clarity. "That's what you're going to say to me," she said. It was not a question. He set the glass down on the armrest. "It's my house, Isabella. You know how I feel about surprises." Victoria said nothing. She pulled the blanket slightly tighter around her own shoulders and looked toward the window, the practiced indifference of a woman who had learned when to disappear from a conversation. "Get that off her," Isabella said. Damien tilted his head. "Excuse me?" "The blanket." Isabella's voice did not shake. She had not expected it to. "Tell her to take it off." He looked at her for a long moment with an expression she had seen before. Not quite contempt, not quite amusement, but something that lived in the space between them. Something that had been growing for years. "You're upset," he said. "I understand that, but let's not make this into something it isn't." "What is it then?" "A misunderstanding." He said the word without a trace of apology in it, like it was a clinical assessment of the situation, like he was explaining a weather pattern to a person who did not understand meteorology. The anger that moved through Isabella in that moment was not the hot, exploding kind. It was the cold kind, the kind that comes from recognizing something you have suspected for a long time and have finally confirmed. "You don't think you owe me an explanation," she said. "I think," Damien said slowly, uncrossing his leg, "that you are standing in my house, in a room that exists because I paid for it, in a life that functions because of what I built. So let's be careful about the word owe." Victoria quietly reached up and removed the blanket from her own shoulders. She set it carefully on the arm of the ottoman and stood. "I'll give you 2 a moment," she said softly, and she left the room without making eye contact with either of them. The door clicked shut behind her, and then it was just the 2 of them, the music still playing, the rain still hitting the windows. Damien stood from the chair. He was a tall man, broad, heavy in the shoulders, the kind of physical presence that had made men step backward in doorways their entire lives. He walked to the window and stood with his back to her for a moment, looking out at the storm, and then he turned. "You knew what I was when you married me," he said. "You didn't walk into this blind. I walked in thinking I was marrying someone who respected me." He made a sound that was almost a laugh. "Respect." He said the word like it was something quaint. "I gave you security, Isabella. I gave you protection. Before me, what did you have? What were you?" He shook his head. "I pulled you out of a quiet little life going nowhere, and I brought you here, into all of this. And you want to stand there and lecture me about respect?" She said nothing. He kept going. You've been comfortable for 5 years. You've had things women spend their whole lives working toward and never reaching. And because of one night where you come home without warning, he stopped himself, recalibrated. His voice dropped. Don't make this into a war, Isabella. You won't like what that looks like. She looked at him for a long time. She thought about her mother, who had told her once, very quietly, while they were sitting on the fire escape of a small apartment in a city that never slept. The people who try to shrink you are always afraid of what you'd become if you grew. She thought about 5 years of dinners where Damien had introduced her to his associates without using her last name. 5 years of being described as my wife and never as Isabella Vane. 5 years of watching him take up every room he walked into while she made herself smaller and told herself it was her choice because she loved him, because she thought patience was the same thing as faith. She walked to the small table beside her reading chair. She set her bag down on the floor. She reached up and removed her wedding ring. It came off her finger without resistance, which felt significant in a way she did not want to examine too closely. She placed it on the table, gently, without drama. Isabella, I spent 5 years trying to make you see me, she said. Her voice was even, completely even. Not what I came from. Not what you imagined I needed. Me. I stayed quiet when I should have spoken. I made myself small so you would feel large. I waited because I believed that eventually you would look at me. Actually look and understand what was standing in front of you. Damien stared at her. Tonight I understand that was never going to happen. She picked up her bag from the floor. You never wanted to see me. You wanted a version of me that confirmed what you already believed about yourself. You don't walk out of this house, he said, and the ease was gone from his voice now, something harder underneath it. You don't walk out of my house like this is some decision you get to make on your own. She looked at him one final time. She looked at him the way she had looked at the room when she first entered it, memorizing it, storing it accurately, making sure she would never misremember what this was. I'll be taking my mother's blanket, she said. She crossed the room, picked up the blanket from the ottoman, folded it with care, and placed it in her bag. Then she walked out. Damien did not stop her. He stood in her sitting room with her wedding ring on the table beside his empty glass and listened to her footsteps move down the hallway, down the stairs, through the front entrance, and then nothing. Nothing but the rain. He poured himself another drink. He told himself she would be back by morning. Maybe sooner. She had no car of her own on the property tonight. She had come in a hired car. It was raining. It was dark. She was emotional. She had nowhere to go. He was very calm about it. He sat back down in her reading chair and finished his drink. He was very calm and very certain, and he did not for a single moment, allow himself to consider the possibility that he had just made the worst miscalculation of his life. Outside, Isabella stood at the end of the private road in the rain and took out her phone. She did not call a car service. She did not call a friend. She scrolled to a number she had not dialed in 8 months, a contact listed under a single name, no last name, no title. Lucian. She pressed call. He answered on the second ring. Isabella. His voice was calm, careful, the voice of a man who had been waiting for exactly this. She stood in the rain with her bag over one shoulder and her mother's blanket inside it, and the storm coming down around her, and she said 2 words. Activate everything. There was a pause of exactly 1 second. Understood, Lucian said, and ended the call. Isabella put the phone back in her coat pocket. She stood there for a moment longer, face tilted slightly upward, rain hitting her cheeks, her jaw, the bridge of her nose. Then she picked up her bag, squared her shoulders, and started walking. She did not look back at the house. Not once. Behind her, every light in the Volkov estate was still burning. Damien's empire, glowing in the dark like it believed itself permanent. He had no idea. He had absolutely no idea what that phone call had just set into motion. No idea who Isabella Vane actually was beneath the 5 years of quiet dinners and careful silences. No idea that the woman he had dismissed as lucky, as saved, had been sitting beside him all this time with enough power to remake the world he thought only he controlled. He would find out. Soon. But tonight, the storm was still coming in. And Isabella Vane walked into it like she'd been walking into storms her whole life, to be continued in part 2. the day the world learned her name. The rain did not let up until nearly 3 in the morning. By then, Isabella was already inside the car that Lucian had dispatched within 11 minutes of her phone call. A dark, unremarkable sedan driven by a man who did not introduce himself, did not ask questions, and kept his eyes on the road the way professionals do when they understand that silence is part of the job. The car smelled faintly of leather and cold air. Isabella sat in the back with her bag on her lap and her mother's blanket folded against her side and watched the city lights blur past the rain-streaked window. She did not cry. She had expected to, somewhere in the back of her mind, had expected that once she was alone and moving and the adrenaline of the confrontation began to thin, something would break open, some valve would release. 5 years of marriage, after all. 5 years of mornings and arguments and silences and small kindnesses that had slowly, without her fully noticing, become less frequent and then almost non-existent. That kind of accumulation does not dissolve cleanly. It leaves residue. But the tears did not come. What came instead was something quieter and more dangerous. A kind of clarity that felt almost physical, like the moment after a fever breaks and the world snaps back into sharp focus and you realize how distorted everything looked while you were burning. She thought about the wedding ring she had left on the table. She thought about the way Damien had looked at her when she placed it down, not with grief, not with panic, but with something closer to impatience, like she was overreacting, like she was a problem he would manage in the morning once she had calmed down and remembered which side of the equation she belonged on. That look told her everything the words had not. The car pulled into the underground garage of a building in the financial district, a building whose name appeared on no public directory, whose upper floors were accessible by key card only, whose existence was known to a very specific category of people. Lucian's people. Her people, though she had spent 5 years deliberately not thinking of them that way. Lucian Cross was waiting for her at the elevator. He was 51 years old, lean in the way of men who spent their 30s working 18-hour days and never quite recovered the weight, with close-cropped gray at his temples and the kind of stillness that made rooms feel calmer, simply because he was standing in them. He had worked for Isabella's grandfather for 20 years before the old man died. He had worked for Isabella for 7 years after that, managing a portfolio of investments and companies and quietly amassed holdings that would have made headlines in 3 countries if any of it had ever been reported correctly. He looked at her when she stepped out of the elevator, and something moved across his face that was not pity. He was too careful a man for pity, but something adjacent to it, something that recognized what it was looking at. "You're wet," he said. "I know. There's a change of clothes in the office, and food if you want it." "I don't want food." "Okay." He fell into step beside her without pressing the point. That was one of the things she had always valued about Lucian. He understood the difference between the moments that required comfort and the moments that required forward motion. He had worked alongside her long enough to read which one she was in. The office on the 32nd floor was warm and well lit, all clean lines and dark wood, nothing showy, nothing designed to impress. It was a working space. Maps on one wall, financial data on 3 screens, a long table in the center covered in organized files, and 2 laptops that were already open and running. Isabella set her bag down on the table and looked at the screens. "Show me where we are," she said. Lucian pulled up the primary overview, a cascading diagram of holdings, subsidiaries, acquisition positions, and the network of companies that comprised the structure Isabella's grandfather had built, and she had quietly, methodically expanded over the past 7 years. She studied it for a long moment. "And the Volkov-adjacent holdings?" she said. Lucian pulled up a secondary screen. 14 companies with direct contractual relationships to Damien's legitimate operations. 3 of them are in positions where controlling share acquisition would be achievable inside of 60 days. One of them, he paused briefly, could be done inside a week if you want to move aggressively. "I don't want to move aggressively," Isabella said. "I want to move correctly." He nodded. "Then 60 days. She pulled out the chair at the head of the table and sat down. She was still in the clothes she had worn to the business dinner, a dark tailored dress that was now faintly damp at the shoulders from the rain. She did not change. She put both hands flat on the table and looked at the screens and started to work. They worked through the night. By the time the city outside began to lighten from black to gray to the particular flat silver of an early October dawn, Isabella had reviewed 7 years of strategic positioning in exhaustive detail, had made 3 decisions that Lucian agreed with immediately and 2 that he pushed back on before conceding, and had drafted the framework of a public announcement that would, within the next 30 days, introduce a name to the business world that had been carefully, deliberately kept out of every headline for the better part of a decade. Her name: Isabella Vane. Not Isabella Volkov, not Mrs. Damien Volkov, not anyone's wife. Isabella Vane, whose grandfather had built an empire from nothing, whose mother had taught her what that empire actually cost, and who had spent 5 quiet years beside a man who believed power was something you took from people rather than something you built with them. At 6:47 in the morning, Lucian poured 2 cups of coffee and set one in front of her without being asked. "He'll send people," Lucian said. "Probably today. When she doesn't come back by morning, he'll start making calls." "I know." "Do you want—" "No," she said before he could finish. "I don't want protection that looks like hiding. Whatever he sends, let it come. Let them find out what they find out." She wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. "The truth is, the only defense I need—" Lucian looked at her for a moment. "You've been sitting on this for 5 years, Isabella." "I was waiting." "For what?" She looked at the window. The city was coming awake outside, Mum. Lights in offices, the sound of traffic beginning to build 20 floors below, the ordinary machinery of a day that had no idea yet what it was about to carry. "I was waiting to find out if I was wrong about him," she said. "I'm not patient by nature, you know that. I was trying to be fair. And I wasn't wrong." She picked up her coffee, which is both the worst possible outcome and also somehow a relief. Lucian did not say anything to that. He understood it. At 9 in the morning, 3 floors below in Damien Volkov's private office downtown, a phone call was made. His head of intelligence, a man named Carver, heavy-set, meticulous, humorless, sat across the desk from Damien with a leather folder open on his knees and delivered the night's findings with the flat efficiency of a man who had been delivering bad news to powerful people for the better part of 15 years. Isabella had not gone to a hotel. She had not gone to any of the friends Damien's people had on their list, the handful of women she occasionally had dinner with, the former colleague who lived in the West End. She had gone to a building in the financial district that, upon investigation, appeared to be registered to a holding company called Cross Vein Capital Management. Damien sat very still on the other side of the desk when Carver said that. "Say that again," Damien said. "Cross Vein Capital Management," Carver repeated without inflection. "Registered 6 years ago. Primary holder is listed as a trust under the surname Vane." The silence in the room was not comfortable. "Dig further," Damien said. His voice was even, controlled. The voice of a man who has learned over many years that showing reaction is showing weakness. Carver nodded. He dug further. By noon, he had enough to fill 20 minutes of careful presentation, which he delivered to Damien in the same flat tone. Folder open, no editorializing, just facts laid end to end like bricks in a road that led somewhere none of them had expected. Cross Vein Capital Management was not a shell company. It was not a paper structure. It was a fully operational investment management firm with holdings across 4 sectors, active positions in 11 companies, and assets under management in a figure that Carver stated twice, because Damien had looked at him the first time in a way that suggested he may not have heard correctly. He had heard correctly. "That's her?" Damien said. "The trust is in her name," Carver said carefully. "The operational leadership appears to be a man named Lucian Cross, but all ultimate authority roots back to the trust, which routes back to Isabella Vane." "Volkov," Damien said. Carver paused. "The trust was established 6 years ago under the name Vane, sir, before the marriage." Another silence. Damien stood up from the desk and walked to the window of his office, the same movement he made when he needed to manage something, some internal tide that he refused to allow onto his face. He stood there with his hands clasped behind his back, and looked out at the city and thought about 5 years of dinners where he had introduced her as my wife. 5 years of telling his associates, his actual associates, the men who knew exactly what his organization was and what it did, that Isabella was not involved in business, was not interested in business, was a quiet woman, kind-natured, no ambitions in that direction. He had said it enough times that he had believed it. He had believed it because he had wanted it to be true. Because if it was true, he was the architect of everything between them. He was the gravity she orbited. He was the reason any of it worked. Find out everything, he said, still facing the window. Everything. Where the money came from, what she's holding, who she's connected to, and what she's been doing for the past 7 years. All of it. Yes, sir, Carver said. And find out where she is right now. Carver hesitated, just slightly. She's still in the financial district building, as far as we can tell. She hasn't left. Then she's working. He said it almost to himself, still facing the window. She didn't go home because she was hurt. She went there because she had somewhere to go. He paused. She's been there all night. Carver said nothing. He understood that this was not a moment that invited response. Damien turned from the window. There was something different in his face now. Not rage. Rage he managed. Not grief. He didn't go there easily. It was something else. Something colder and more specific. The particular expression of a man who has just discovered that the game he thought he was playing had entirely different rules than the ones he was given. "Get me Victor," he said. Victor Wren was his oldest advisor. 70 years old, former lawyer, had been part of the organization since before Damien inherited it. Carver made the call. Victor arrived within the hour, and he listened to everything Carver had assembled, and when it was over he sat quietly for a moment with his hands folded on the table before he said anything. "You didn't know," Victor said. It was not a question. "No," Damien said. "And you've been married to her for 5 years." "Yes." Victor unfolded his hands. "Then she's very good." The words landed in a way that Damien did not visibly react to, but that hit something real. Because Victor Wren did not distribute compliments carelessly. He was a man who assessed accurately and without sentiment, and when he said she's very good in that particular tone, he meant it as a precise evaluation of capability. She was very good, which meant Damien had been, for 5 years, living beside someone operating at a level he had never credited her with. "What does she want?" Victor said. "I don't know yet." "Does she know about the Castellano arrangement?" The Castellano arrangement was the name they used internally for a long-standing agreement between the Volkov organization and a competing network. A deal that was, legally speaking, constructed on paperwork so thin that the right attorney with the right documentation could turn it into a catastrophic exposure event. Damien had kept that arrangement very compartmentalized. "She shouldn't," he said. "But she was in the house for 5 years," Victor said. "People talk, staff talks. And if she's the kind of person who listens carefully—" "She is," Damien said. The words came out before he could calibrate them. Victor looked at him. "She always was," Damien said, quieter. "I just told myself she was listening to the wrong things." Victor stood slowly, the way old men stand when they've been sitting in the same position too long. He buttoned his jacket. "You need to call her," he said, "before this becomes something you cannot shape. Right now it's still a domestic matter. Tomorrow it may be a business matter. And the day after that—" "I know," Damien said. "Call her." He did not call her, not that night, and not the following morning. What he did instead was what Damien Volkov had always done when confronted with something that did not obey his expectations. He waited for it to come to him. He expected gravity to do what it always did. He expected the situation to collapse back toward him, because in his experience, situations always did. He was wrong. On the 4th day after Isabella walked out, a press release moved through several major financial news services simultaneously. It was brief, precisely worded, and announced the public emergence of Isabella Vane and the launch of Vane Strategic Partners, a company built on 7 years of private development, operating across technology, infrastructure, and emerging markets. The press release did not mention Damien. It did not mention marriage. It did not mention the Volkov name at all. It introduced Isabella Vane as the granddaughter of Chester Vane, the legendary industrialist whose investments in the 1970s and 80s had helped reshape entire sectors of American manufacturing. It noted her prior entrepreneurial work, conducted under various anonymous structures. It announced her intention to make Vane Strategic Partners one of the most significant privately held investment firms in the country within the next 3 years. The financial media moved quickly. Within 6 hours, 3 major publications had run features. Within 12 hours, the story had spread internationally. By the following morning, the question being asked in boardrooms that Damien's organization had business relationships with was not about Damien at all. It was, who is Isabella Vane, and how did no one know about her? Damien found out about the press release from Carver, who placed the printed article on his desk without commentary at 7 in the morning. He read it twice. He was very still while he read it. Then he called his lawyers, and he called Victor, and he called 2 of his most senior partners. And by 10 o'clock in the morning, he was sitting at the head of his conference table with 5 people around him who all wore the same careful expression. The expression of professionals who have just discovered that a situation they believed was internal and contained had become something considerably larger. She did this in 4 days, one of the partners said. His name was Marsh, mid-40s, sharp, always the first to identify a threat. 4 days and she has front-page coverage in 3 major... I can read, Damien said. Marsh stopped talking. The room was quiet for a moment. This was not built in 4 days, Victor said, from the far end of the table. His voice was patient, careful, and aimed very specifically at Damien. This was built over years. This was built while she was here, while she was in your house. He paused. The question is not what she's doing. The question is what she knows, and what she intends to do with it. Damien looked at the article on the table in front of him. There was a photograph. He had not expected the photograph to affect him the way it did, but it did. It was a professional headshot. Isabella in a dark jacket, hair pulled back, looking directly at the camera with an expression he had never once seen on her face in 5 years of marriage. Not cold, not aggressive, not performative, just completely, entirely certain. She looked like a person who had stopped waiting for something. He realized, looking at that photograph, that he had never seen her look like that before. Not once, in 5 years. He had seen her patient. He had seen her careful. He had seen her kind in ways he had privately catalogued as naive. He had seen her cry once, quietly, in the garden after her mother's last hospitalization, when she thought he was still inside the house. But he had never seen her look like this, like she had finally stopped pulling her own punches. Find out what she knows about Castellano, he said. His voice was flat, professional. Today. I need to know today. Carver nodded. But 3 hours later, Carver came back with something Damien had not asked for and had not anticipated, something that changed the entire shape of what was already in motion. One of the 14 companies with contractual relationships to Damien's legitimate operations had received, that morning, a letter of intent from a purchasing entity. The entity was a subsidiary of Cross Vein Capital Management. It was not a hostile letter. It was entirely polite. It expressed genuine interest in acquiring a controlling stake and outlined favorable terms for the existing shareholders. It was the opening move of someone who had thought several steps ahead. Damien stared at the letter for a long time. Then he looked up at Carver and said very quietly, "She's not coming to me." "No, sir," Carver said. "She's not coming to me because she doesn't need to." He set the letter down. "She's already inside." The room around him did not make a sound. Damien Volkov, the man who had spent 20 years making the city afraid of his name, sat in his conference room on a Tuesday morning and understood, with the specific, terrible clarity of a person who has just recognized the true dimensions of their own mistake, that the war he thought hadn't started yet had in fact been decided the night he sat in his wife's reading chair and told her she was lucky he had found her. He picked up his phone. He called Isabella's number for the first time since she had walked out. It rang 4 times. She did not answer. But 30 seconds later, a text arrived. 3 words. "You'll hear from my attorney." Damien set the phone face down on the table. He looked at the letter of intent. He looked at the article. He looked at the photograph of the woman he had told 5 nights ago that she was nothing before him. And somewhere beneath the controlled surface of the most feared man in the city, something shifted. Something that had been load-bearing inside his certainty cracked quietly, in a place he wouldn't be able to find again easily, and let in a cold draft that was going to be very difficult to ignore. He was out of room to wait. She had already moved, and he had already moved, and she had let him believe otherwise. That was the part that would take Damien the longest to understand. Not that Isabella had outmaneuvered him, but that she had done it while appearing to stand completely still, while appearing to be exactly what he had decided she was. While sitting across from him at dinner tables and listening to him explain the world to her as though she had not already mapped it herself, years before he ever came into it. The tech sat on his phone face down on the conference table. "You'll hear from my attorney." 4 days. It had taken her 4 days to go from a woman walking out of his house in the rain to a woman whose name was in the financial press and whose legal team was already in motion. 4 days to dismantle the narrative he had constructed so carefully, so confidently, over 5 years. Victor Wren sat at the far end of the conference table and watched Damien's face with the patience of a man who had lived long enough to know when to speak and when to simply bear witness. "She's better than I thought," Damien said, finally. "Yes," Victor said. "I want to know who her attorney is. We're already running it. And the letter of intent on the Harwick Group. What's the timeline?" Victor opened the folder in front of him. The letter gives the existing shareholders 30 days to respond. If Crossvein gets a controlling stake in Harwick, they have a direct line into your supply chain for the Eastern distribution network. It doesn't break anything immediately, but it gives her leverage, Damien said. "Significant leverage," Victor agreed. Damien stood up. He moved to the window again. The same window, the same posture, hands behind his back, city below him. And he stayed there for a long time. Long enough that two of the partners exchanged a glance across the table that they immediately regretted when Damien turned around. He noticed everything. That had always been true. "Clear the room," he said. "Except Victor." The partners and Carver moved without hesitation, gathering their files, the door closing behind them with the soft, efficient click of people who understood that the space between themselves and Damien Volkov was a thing to be respected and maintained. When they were gone, the room was very quiet. "Tell me what you actually think," Damien said. Victor set down his pen. "I think she's not trying to destroy you. Not yet. If she wanted to destroy you, she would have led with the Castellano exposure, not a letter of intent to a mid-level supply company. She's establishing position. She's telling you she can reach inside your structure without asking your permission." He paused. "That's not an attack, that's a demonstration." "A demonstration of what?" "Of what an attack would look like," Victor said, "if she chose to make one." Damien absorbed that. "She wants something," he said. "Everyone wants something," Victor said. "The question is whether you find out what it is before she decides you're not worth negotiating with." The meeting ended there. What Damien did not know, what no one in that conference room knew, was that 41 blocks away, in the warm, well-lit offices on the 32nd floor, something had gone wrong inside Isabella's own house. She found out at 11:47 that morning, from a source she had not expected and a method she had not prepared for. The call came from a woman named Soren. Dana Soren, 43 years old, forensic accountant, had been part of the Crossvein operational structure for 3 years. Soren was meticulous, private, and good at her job in a way that made other people feel slightly inadequate by comparison. Isabella trusted her completely, which was why the sound of her voice on the phone, flat, tight, stripped of its usual precision, registered as wrong before a single word had been said. "I need you to come to the secondary office," Soren said. "Not the 32nd floor. The secondary." "What happened?" "I need you to see it yourself." The secondary office was a smaller space 3 floors below, used primarily for document review and financial modeling. When Isabella walked in 11 minutes later, Soren was standing at the central table with 3 printed documents laid out in front of her, side by side. And she was looking at them with the expression of someone who has found something they cannot explain and has tried very hard to explain it anyway. Lucian was already there, standing slightly back from the table, arms crossed, jaw set in a way that Isabella recognized. The way he looked when he had already run through the implications of something and had not found a version of them that was acceptable. Isabella looked at the documents. "Walk me through it," she said. Soren picked up the first document. "This is the filing confirmation for the Harwick Letter of Intent, submitted this morning through our legal team at Kellerman Associates." She set it down and picked up the second. "This is a separate filing, submitted through a different channel, under a different subsidiary name, 3 hours before our filing went in." Isabella looked at the second document. The subsidiary name on it was a variation, small, deliberate, the kind of difference that could be argued as clerical in a courtroom, but that, to anyone who understood how these structures worked, was clearly intentional. The filing established a competing interest in Harwick Group under terms that preempted the cross-vein position. "Who filed this?" Isabella said. Soren put down the second document and picked up the third. "That's what took us the time. The filing routes through 4 entities before it reaches a registered holder." She laid the third document on the table. "The registered holder is a trust." Isabella looked at the name on the document. She looked at it for a moment longer than she needed to. "That's our trust structure," she said. "A version of it," Soren said. "It's close enough that the initial routing looks identical, but the final beneficial holder is different." She pointed to a name at the bottom of the third page. The name was Elliot Vane. Isabella did not move. The room did not make a sound. Elliot Vane was her cousin, her mother's brother's son, 10 years older than Isabella, a man she had seen perhaps a dozen times in her adult life, always at the margins of family gatherings, always pleasant in the particular way of people who are pleasant because they want something and have not yet found the right moment to ask for it. He had been cut out of Chester Vane's estate, deliberately, specifically, by name, in language that her grandfather had chosen with a care that Isabella understood even as a young woman was not arbitrary. Chester Vane had been a precise man. When he made decisions about who to trust and who not to trust, he made them once and did not revisit them. He had not trusted Elliot. Isabella had accepted that without ever fully investigating why. "How long has this structure been active?" Isabella said. Her voice was even. She was working hard to keep it even. "That's the part I can't make fit," Soren said. She picked up her own notes, handwritten, which Soren only did when she was thinking faster than she could type. "The earliest entity in the chain was registered 4 years ago. 4 years ago. 3 years before Isabella had activated any of this. 3 years before she had made the phone call to Lucian. Before she had set anything in motion. Before she had walked out of the Volkov estate with her bag and her mother's blanket. Someone had started building this structure 4 years ago. Someone had been watching." "Lucian," Isabella said, without turning from the documents. "I didn't know," Lucian said. His voice was careful, but beneath the care there was something else. Something that sounded like a man doing rapid, brutal self-assessment. "I vetted Elliot 3 years ago when he reached out through an intermediary about the estate. I told him there was nothing to discuss. I thought that was the end of it. He reached out to you and you didn't tell me. I didn't think he was relevant." The silence after that was very specific. Isabella turned from the table. She looked at Lucian, really looked at him, and she did not say anything for a moment. Lucian was one of the few people in her life she had never questioned. 20 years of her grandfather's trust, 7 years of her own. She had built the entire operational infrastructure of her reemergence on his management of it. And he had received a contact from her cousin, the one person her grandfather had specifically excluded and had not mentioned it. "Why didn't you think he was relevant?" she said. "Because I handled it," Lucien said. "He made a vague claim about the estate. I shut it down. He went away. I made a judgment call." "You made a judgment call about my family without telling me." "Yes." He didn't deflect it. "And I'm looking at this table right now understanding that was a mistake." The thing about Lucian was that he never lied. That was part of what made this worse. He was telling her exactly what had happened, with full acknowledgement of the error, and it still meant that for 4 years, while she had been living inside Damien's house and believing that the structure she was building was sealed and private and safe, her cousin had been constructing something alongside it, using her grandfather's name and her family's architecture, and she had not known. "Where is he?" Isabella said. "We're running his current location," Soren said. "He has a residence in Connecticut. He also maintains a secondary address in the city." "Find him." Isabella turned back to the table. She put both hands flat on the surface, the same way she had the night she arrived. The gesture of a person planting themselves, refusing to be moved. "And I need to know if Damien is connected to this." The question landed with a weight that everyone in the room felt. Lucian was the one who said what they were all calculating. If Damien knew about Elliot and used him to plant a competing position inside your structure before you activated, then it wasn't a domestic argument that night, Isabella said. It was a setup. She straightened up. She walked to the window, a smaller window than Damien's, lower floor, the city at a different angle. And she stood there for a moment with her arms crossed and thought about the night she had come home early. The music, the open door, Victoria Hale in her chair, wrapped in her mother's blanket. She thought about how Damien had not looked surprised. She had attributed that to his particular brand of arrogance. The man who believed his world was inviolable, who processed inconvenience as a reflection of others' failure rather than his own. She had read his lack of panic as entitlement. But what if it had not been entitlement? What if he had simply known he was protected? What if coming home early had not exposed him? What if it had triggered something? She turned from the window. "Get me everything on Elliot Vane," she said. "Bank records if we can reach them legally, public filings, property, associates, and I want to know the name of every attorney who has touched any entity in that chain." She looked at Soren. "How quickly?" 12 hours, Soren said. "Maybe less." "Make it less." Soren was already moving. Lucian stayed. Isabella looked at him. "You should have told me about the contact." "Yes," he said again. "If this comes back and it's worse than what's on that table." "Then that's on me," Lucian said. "Fully. I know that." She held his gaze for a moment. The thing she could not afford right now, the thing she refused to allow herself, was doubt about Lucian himself. If she pulled that thread, if she began to question the one person who had been managing her structure for 7 years, the entire architecture of what she had built was suspect. She would be alone in a way she was not prepared to be alone. She made a decision. "I'm trusting that you told me everything just now," she said. "Everything you know." "I did," he said. "Good." She picked up her bag from the chair. "Because I need you clear-eyed for what's coming next." What came next arrived faster than 12 hours. It arrived in 4. Dana Soren knocked on the door of the 32nd floor at 3:22 in the afternoon and came in carrying a single printed page. And her face when she handed it to Isabella was the face of someone who has confirmed the worst version of a thing and would have preferred not to have confirmed it. Isabella read the page. She read it once. Then she put it flat on the desk and read it again. The page was a summary of financial movements traced through 3 of Elliot Vane's entity chains over the past 14 months. The movements were clean, properly filed, technically legal. The kind of transactions that looked entirely routine until you traced the destination accounts and found a name that was not Elliot Vane's and was not any Vane at all. The destination accounts belonged to a holding structure used by the Volkov organization for its legitimate business operations. Elliot Vane had been funneling information and financial positioning to Damien Volkov for over a year. Not just the Harwick filing, more. Movements that suggested he had been feeding incremental intelligence about cross-Vane structure and strategy. Not enough to expose it completely, not a flood, but a slow and steady leak. The kind of leak that, over 14 months, would give a careful man a remarkably accurate map of his opponent's terrain. Isabella sat down. She did not do it intentionally. Her legs simply decided, and she sat. She thought about Damien reading those financial summaries in his office. Damien learning, piece by piece, month by month, that the woman he believed was a quiet presence at his dinner table was sitting on an empire. Not finding it out suddenly, the way she had planned for him to discover it on her terms. But learning it incrementally, with enough time to prepare, to build counterpositions, to establish a competing claim before she could even begin. She thought about the night she came home. She thought about Victoria Hale being there, being visible, being impossible to miss. She thought about Damien's voice. You should have called. Not surprise. Not exposure. An invitation. He had wanted her to come in that night. He had wanted her to see it. He had wanted to push her into motion, into activating the structure she had been sitting on, because he already knew what that structure looked like, and he had already built something to intercept it. The marriage had not ended because she walked in on him. She had been walked into walking in on him. Isabella put both hands flat on the desk and looked at the wall in front of her. The feeling that moved through her in that moment was something she did not have an easy name for. It was not rage, though rage was underneath it. It was not grief, though the grief was very specific and very real, the grief of understanding that the 5 years she had spent asking herself whether she was wrong about him had been years she should not have spent in the house at all. The grief of kindness that was taken seriously by no one. What it was, mostly, was cold. The kind of cold that comes from standing in a place where you thought you had solid ground and finding that it was carefully constructed to feel solid while being nothing of the kind. She picked up the page. She stood up. She walked to Lucian's office down the hall, and she opened the door without knocking, and she put the page on his desk and watched him read it. He read it slowly. His face changed in increments, a tightening around the eyes, a stillness in the jaw, and then something she had never seen on Lucian's face in 7 years of working together, something that looked like fury. "When did the first payment move?" he said, his voice very controlled. 14 months ago, Isabella said. He looked up at her. "That's before the Castellano exposure risk became actionable, before he had a reason to hedge against you specifically." He put the page down. "He wasn't protecting himself from you. He was planning to use you." "I know." "He knew you were going to move eventually. He set Elliot up to front-run your positions. When you activated, he'd already be inside your structure with a competing claim. He could tie up the Harwick acquisition in legal disputes for 2 years. He could use the similarity of the trust names to create confusion about who holds what. He could drag you into litigation that cost you the momentum of the launch." Lucian's voice was still controlled, but only technically. "He was going to let you do all the work and then stand in front of it." "Yes," Isabella said. "Isabella, I need you to listen to me," she said. Her voice was very quiet. "Because I am only going to say this once, and then I need us to move, and I need to move fast." She pulled out the chair across from his desk and sat down and looked at him directly. "I am not going to let this become a story about a woman who was outmaneuvered by her husband. I am not going to let Damian Volkov or Elliot Vane or anyone else in that chain look back on this and say that they saw me coming and turned it against me." She put her hands together on the desk. "Which means what I plan to do, I cannot do. Not the way I planned it." Lucian waited. The public emergence, the press release, the positioning, he expected all of that. He built around it. Which means anything he anticipated, I cannot use. She took a breath. "I have to be willing to go somewhere he is not prepared for." "Where?" Lucian said. Isabella looked at him. The thing she was about to say was the thing she had spent 5 years avoiding, the thing that went against every instinct she had inherited from her grandfather, who had built a fortune on discretion, on privacy, on the principle that the person who speaks first in a negotiation has already lost a degree of control. "I'm going to meet with his people," she said. "Not his lawyers, not his advisors, his actual people. The ones inside the organization who have been watching him make decisions for years, and who are not stupid, and who know, on some level, even if they would never say it, that the structure there inside is increasingly unstable." Lucian was very still. "You're going to walk into his organization. I'm going to give his organization a reason to listen to someone other than him." "That's not just bold," Lucian said carefully. "That's the kind of thing you don't come back from if it goes wrong." "I know," Isabella said. She stood up. She picked up the page from his desk and folded it and put it in her jacket pocket. "Get me a meeting with Marcus Webb," she said. Marcus Webb was Damian's head of legitimate operations, the man who ran the legal side of the business, who managed the real estate holdings and the manufacturing investments and the 3 regional companies that gave the Volkov name its respectable face. He was also, according to everything Soren had been able to assemble in the last 4 days, A man who had been in quiet, private disagreement with Damien's decision-making for the better part of 2 years. Webb won't meet with you, Lucian said, not without Damien knowing. Get me the meeting, Isabella said. I'll make sure Damien knows. Lucian looked at her for a long moment. You want him to know you're going to his people? I want him to know that I am not afraid of him knowing, she said. That's different. She walked to the door of his office. There is one more thing, she said, hand on the frame, not turning. Elliot, when you find him, we've found him, Lucian said. He's at the Connecticut address. Bring him in, Isabella said, quietly. I want to talk to him before anyone else does. She paused. He's family, which means this is going to be the ugliest conversation I've had in a very long time. She left the office. She walked back down the hall to the 32nd floor and stood at the window for a moment, looking at the city the way she had looked at it the night she arrived. But different now. The city looked different now that she understood the shape of what had been constructed against her. She reached into her jacket pocket and touched the folded page. 14 months. Damien had known about her for 14 months, had been sitting across from her at dinner, sleeping in the same house, playing the role of the overbearing husband who underestimated his quiet wife, while knowing, while building, while letting Elliot Vane run interference through her own family name, the performance of that, the patience of it. She had given him credit for many things. She had not given him credit for that, which meant there was something else. There was always something else when a careful man took this kind of risk. He would not have done all of this simply to protect a supply chain position or slow down an acquisition. He had done this because something about what she had was not just a threat to his business. It was a threat to something he could not afford to lose under any circumstances. She needed to know what that was before she walked into a room with Marcus Webb. She needed to know what Damien Volkov was actually afraid of. And there was only one person alive who might be willing to tell her, who would know the answer, who had been close enough to Damien long enough to have seen behind the performance, a person she had not spoken to in 6 months, who had left the Volkov organization under circumstances that were never fully explained, who had sent Isabella a single cryptic message 8 weeks ago that she had filed away and not pursued because the timing had not felt right. The timing felt right now. She took out her phone. She found the message. It was 4 words sent from a number she recognized as belonging to a woman named Reina Solano, who had been Damien's personal assistant for 6 years before she disappeared quietly from the organization with a severance package and a non-disclosure agreement that covered, by its very specific language, a range of topics that suggested whoever wrote it had been very deliberate about what they did not want discussed. 4 words. When you're ready, call. Isabella pressed the call button. It rang once. Reina Solano answered on the first ring, as though she had been waiting with the phone already in her hand, as though she had known, the way certain people know, the ones who pay close attention and understand the weight of the things they carry, that this call was always going to come, and that when it did, there would be very little time to waste. I've been expecting you, Reina said. I know, Isabella said. I need to know what he's protecting. A pause, short but specific. Not on the phone, Reina said, and not anywhere near the city. Name the place. Another pause. Longer this time. The pause of a person doing a final calculation about whether the thing they are about to do is survivable. Not dramatically, not with fear exactly, but with the sober precision of someone who has thought about this moment and knows what it Reina Solano named a town 3 hours north of the city. A place called Harlan's Creek, population under 2,000, the kind of town that exists in the space between other places. A gas station, a diner, a motel with a vacancy sign that had been missing the second A for long enough that no one noticed anymore. She named a specific diner on the main road and a specific time, 7 in the morning, 2 days from now. Come alone, Reina said. I will, Isabella said. I mean it. No Lucian, no driver, nobody. I understood you the first time. Another pause. And then very quietly, in a voice that had dropped below professionalism into something rawer. He's going to know you're moving. If he figures out you contacted me, he'll know I'm moving regardless, Isabella said. That's not the problem anymore. She ended the call. She stood at the window for another full minute, phone in her hand, looking at the city below and thinking about the 14 months. Thinking about Damien sitting across from her at dinner, passing the breadbasket, asking about her day, performing the ordinary theater of a marriage he had long since decided was a tactical position rather than a human relationship. She thought about how good he was at it. She had believed for 5 years that his coldness was his wound, that somewhere beneath the control and the arrogance was a person who did not know how to be soft, who had been formed by violence and distrust and had never learned another way. She had told herself that patience was not weakness, that choosing to see the person beneath the damage was not naivety. She had been wrong about the damage. The damage was real, but she had been wrong about what it had made him. It had not made him someone who could not be reached. It had made him someone who had decided not to be. That distinction mattered. It mattered in a way that changed something fundamental in how she intended to proceed. She slept 4 hours that night, on the small couch in the office, under her mother's blanket. She did not dream, or if she did not remember it. She woke at 5, made coffee from the small machine on the filing cabinet, and sat at the table in the half-dark and thought very carefully about every move available to her and what each one cost. By the time the city came fully awake outside, she had decided. The meeting with Marcus Webb happened first. She had expected Damien to move to prevent it. Webb was his man, had been for 12 years, had managed the legitimate operations with a competence that gave the Volkov name its credibility in rooms where the other version of Damien's business would not have been welcome. She had expected Damien to reach Webb before she could, to instruct him, to close that door before she reached it. Instead, Webb came to her. He arrived at the 32nd floor at 10 in the morning, unannounced, having apparently told no one at the Volkov organization that he was coming. He was a compact man, late 50s, the kind of careful dresser who uses clothing as a signal of control. Every button, every crease, exactly where it should be. He had thin gray hair and hands that were slightly too large for his frame, and eyes that had spent a long time watching things from a careful distance. He sat down across from Isabella at the conference table and looked at her with an expression that was almost clinical. "You didn't need to go through Lucian," he said. "I was going to reach out anyway." Isabella looked at him. "When?" "When I saw the Harwick filing." He folded his hands on the table. "I've been watching the company's exposure for 2 years. Damien has been making decisions that are, structurally, legally, increasingly indefensible. The Castellano arrangement alone is enough to end several careers if it surfaces in the wrong context." He paused. "I have a family. I have 2 daughters. I am not interested in being the man who goes down with a ship because the captain refused to read the weather." "So this is about self-preservation," Isabella said. "It's about being realistic," Webb said, "which is something that has become very difficult inside that organization." He looked at her steadily. "You have the Castellano documentation?" Isabella said nothing, which was, in itself, an answer. Webb nodded slowly. "I thought so. There were only 3 people who had full access to those arrangements. Victor knew, I knew. And Damien believed the third person, a contract lawyer named Ferris, who left the organization 18 months ago, had been fully managed." He paused again. "I'm guessing Ferris was not as fully managed as Damien believed." "I'm not going to confirm or deny what I have," Isabella said. "What I want to know from you is this. If the legitimate side of the business were restructured, genuinely restructured, with new oversight, clean documentation, and a leadership model that doesn't depend on one person's authority holding everything in place, is there enough there to survive? Is there a real business under all of it?" Webb looked at her for a long moment. "Yes," he said. "There's a real business. It's been kept real because some of us insisted on it. But it's been used as cover often enough that the line between the 2 sides is," he paused, choosing the word carefully, "blurred in places. Can the blur be cleaned up? With the right documentation, the right cooperation, and the right legal structure." He thought about it genuinely. Most of it. There are elements that cannot be salvaged, but the core, the manufacturing interests, the real estate holdings, the Eastern distribution network, those are legitimate. They employ real people. They generate real revenue. He looked at her. "What are you proposing?" "I'm not proposing anything yet," Isabella said. "I'm determining whether there's something worth proposing." He held her gaze. "And if there is?" Then the people inside it, who have been trying to keep it real, deserve to know that someone is planning to protect that rather than burn it down. Webb was quiet for a moment. "You're not what he told people you were," he said. "No," Isabella said. "I'm not." He left 30 minutes later, back straight, briefcase in hand, every button exactly where it should be. He did not tell her he would cooperate. He did not make any promises. But before he walked out, he turned at the door and said, very quietly, "The Castellano meeting notes, if you have them. The ones from the March session 3 years ago, those are the ones that matter most." Isabella looked at him. "I know," she said. He left. She sat at the table alone for a moment after the door closed. She had the March session notes, had them for 4 years, passed to her through a chain she had constructed carefully, from a source she would not name even to Lucian. She had kept them the way you keep insurance, not because you intend to use them, but because having them changes what you are willing to walk into. Now she was about to walk into something that required every piece of cover she had. She drove herself north 2 mornings later. She had told Lucian she was going. She had not told him where. He had looked at her with the expression of a man who wanted to argue and had the self-awareness to know it would not work, and he had said, "Check in at noon. If I don't hear from you by noon, I'm moving." "By noon," she had agreed. The drive north took her through the kind of country that the city forgot existed. Farmland and old highway and trees that had been growing long before anyone built anything around them, indifferent to everything below. The October light was thin and pale, the sky the specific white of a day that cannot decide whether to rain. She reached Harlan's Creek at 6:40 in the morning. The diner was called Patsy's. Red vinyl booze, the smell of coffee and bacon fat, a counter with spinning stools, and a woman behind it who looked like she had been pouring coffee since before Isabella was born. 3 other customers. A man in work boots staring at his phone, an older couple sharing a newspaper without speaking. Reina Solano was in the back booth. She was 51 years old with dark hair going silver at the temples, and the particular quality of stillness that comes not from calm, but from long practice at concealing its absence. She had been Damien's personal assistant for 6 years, which meant she had spent 6 years in the specific proximity of a powerful and dangerous man, managing his calendar and his communications and his moods, and she had survived it, which said something about her. She had a coffee cup in front of her. She watched Isabella cross the diner and slide into the opposite seat, and did not say anything until the waitress had come and gone and they were alone. "You look like you haven't slept," Reina said. "I've slept enough," Isabella said. "Tell me what he's protecting." Reina looked at her coffee cup, wrapped both hands around it, the hands of a woman who needed something to hold on to while she said what she was about to say. "Before I tell you," Reina said, "I need you to understand something. What I'm about to give you, this is everything. This is the thing I took when I left, the thing I've been sitting on for 18 months because I didn't know who I could trust with it. And because I knew that the moment I gave it to someone, I was either safe or I was finished." She looked up. "If you use this wrong, it doesn't just hurt Damien. It exposes people who are genuinely innocent. Staff, families, people who were just inside it and didn't know how to get out." "I understand," Isabella said. "I need to hear you say you'll protect them." "I will protect anyone who didn't choose to be part of what he built," Isabella said. "That's not a negotiation. That's a condition I'm putting on myself regardless of what you tell me." Reina studied her face for a long moment. Then she reached into the bag beside her on the seat and removed a thin envelope and placed it on the table between them. 4 years ago, Reina said, Damien entered into an arrangement with a federal contractor. Not a criminal contact, an actual government contractor, a man named Halden, who ran a private intelligence firm with federal clients. The arrangement was simple on its surface. Damien provided certain logistical resources for operations that Halden's firm could not officially support. In exchange, Halden provided Damien with advance notification of federal investigations that might affect his organization. Isabella was very still. That arrangement ran for 2 years, Reina said, until Halden died. Cardiac event, nothing suspicious. But when Halden died, the documentation of the arrangement, the communications, the financial transfers, the operational logs, did not die with him. His firm maintained records, and 6 months after Halden died, someone inside that firm began to understand what they were sitting on. Who? Isabella said. A woman named Claire Ashe, junior analyst, 29 years old, no prior connection to Damien or to the Volkov organization. She found the records in a routine file audit. Raina paused. She went to the authorities. Which authorities? Federal. She went directly to a federal task force that had been, coincidentally, building a separate case involving government corruption and private contracting. Her documentation fit their existing architecture perfectly. Raina's voice was controlled, but barely. That case is not theoretical. It is active. It has been active for 14 months, and it is built significantly around Damien Volkov's arrangement with Halden. 14 months. The same window. The same timeline as Elliot Vane's financial movements feeding intelligence back to Damien. He found out about the case, Isabella said. It was not a question. Yes, 14 months ago. Halden's original contact inside the federal structure, the one who had been giving Damien advance warning, was still in place and still loyal, and he told Damien that the case existed. Raina put both hands flat on the table. That was when everything changed. That was when Damien stopped making decisions like a man running a criminal organization and started making decisions like a man trying to survive a federal prosecution. Isabella thought about the 14 months, about Elliot Vane's movements, about the structure built around her, about the night she came home to the open door and the music and the blanket on Victoria Hale's shoulders. He needed leverage, Isabella said. He found out I had the Castellano documentation, or suspected I had it, and he needed something to trade. If I held evidence that could be used against him domestically, he needed something he could use against me, or at minimum something he could use to complicate my position enough that I couldn't move cleanly. He wasn't trying to destroy you, Raina said. He was trying to use you, to make you into a piece in a game you didn't know you were playing. Isabella picked up the envelope. Inside were copies of documents, communications, financial logs, partial transcripts, enough to confirm what Raina had described. Enough to give an attorney with the right access the material to change the shape of a federal case. She put the documents back in the envelope. She looked at Raina Solano across the red vinyl booth in the diner in Harlan's Creek, and she felt the weight of it. Not just the information, but the 18 months Raina had carried it alone. The 18 months of knowing something that large and sitting with it in silence because there was no one safe enough to tell. Why me? Isabella said. Why not go directly to the federal task force yourself? Because going directly gets me buried, Raina said. The moment I surface as a source, I become a problem for both sides. Damien's remaining loyalists will treat me as a threat. The federal case may try to use me as a witness in ways that expose me to liability for things I saw without participating in. She shook her head. I need someone who can receive this and use it correctly. Someone who has the resources and the legal structure and the credibility to be taken seriously when she walks into a room with it. She looked at Isabella steadily. That's not me. That's you. Isabella sat with that for a moment. You understand what this does, Isabella said. If this is what you say it is, and if I use it correctly, it ends the prosecution against Damien as a simple criminal matter and turns it into something much larger. The people above Halden who knew, the contractor network, the federal exposure, that doesn't go away quietly. I know, Raina said. And Damien cooperates or he drowns, Raina said. Those are the only two options available to him. But the difference between drowning alone and cooperating is the difference between a man who spends the rest of his life in federal custody and a man who loses his empire but keeps his freedom. She paused. You can give him that choice. Nobody else can. Because nobody else has what you have and what I just gave you and the standing to walk into a room and make it credible. The diner around them continued its ordinary morning. The waitress refilled the man in work boots without being asked. The older couple turned a page of the newspaper simultaneously, neither of them noticing. Isabella put the envelope in her jacket, next to the folded page from Soren. She thought about her grandfather, who had built everything on the principle that the person with the most accurate information was always the most powerful person in a room. She thought about her mother, who had told her that real strength was not the absence of fear, but the refusal to let fear make your decisions for you. She was afraid. She acknowledged it plainly, internally, the way she had learned to acknowledge things, not dramatizing it, not suppressing it, just noting it as a fact the way you note weather. She was afraid because what she was about to do was genuinely dangerous, genuinely irreversible, and had no guaranteed outcome. She was afraid, and she was going to do it anyway. She left $200 on the table, which was far too much for 2 coffees, and she did not care. She drove back to the city in 3 hours and did not stop. She called Lucian at 11:58. "I'm coming in," she said. "Get me an attorney with federal experience. Not Kellerman. Someone outside our existing structure. Someone clean." "How fast?" Lucian said. "Today," Isabella said. "This afternoon." A pause. "Isabella, what did she give you?" "Enough," Isabella said. "Get me the attorney." She ended the call and put both hands on the wheel and drove. The city came back into view on the horizon. The skyline she had looked at from the 32nd floor, from the car window, from the rain-soaked end of Damien's private road 11 days ago. It looked the same as it always had. It would look the same tomorrow. What was going to be different was everything inside it. The attorney's name was Bernard Cho, 55 years old, former federal prosecutor, private practice for the last 8 years, with a reputation that operated on the specific frequency of a man who had seen the inside of complicated situations and come out of them with his ethics intact, which in his field was genuinely unusual. He arrived at the 32nd floor at 3 in the afternoon, sat across from Isabella, and listened for 40 minutes without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "You understand," he said, "that the moment this enters the federal space, you lose control of the pace." "I understand. And if Damien's remaining contact inside the investigation gets word before the documentation is formally submitted, that's why we're moving today," Isabella said. Cho looked at the envelope, looked at the document Soren had produced, looked at the Castellano notes, and the 14 months of financial movements, and the web of Elliot Vane's interference, and the Harwick filing, and everything that Lucian had assembled and that Isabella had organized in the past 11 days, with the kind of precision that comes from 7 years of building something you know will eventually matter. He looked at all of it. "This is enough," he said, not excitedly, just accurately. "I know," Isabella said. "What do you want the outcome to be?" She had thought about this in the car on the way back from Harlan's Creek, for 3 hours of thin October light and empty highway. She had thought about it with the envelope in her jacket pocket and her hands on the wheel and the radio off. "I want the people inside his legitimate businesses protected," she said. "I want the federal exposure managed in a way that doesn't require a spectacle. I want Elliot Vane held legally accountable for the interference in my trust structure. And I want Damien to have the option to cooperate, fully, completely, without reservation, in exchange for the difference between a federal prosecution and a negotiated resolution that keeps him out of a cell." She paused. "I'm not offering him mercy. I'm offering him a choice, the same way he thought he was offering me one." Cho picked up his pen. "And if he refuses?" Isabella looked at the documents on the table. "Then he refuses," she said. "And the documentation goes where it goes, and the outcome is what it is." She did not flinch while she said it. "But he won't refuse, because Damien Volkov is many things, and most of them are terrible, but he is not stupid, and he will understand when he sees what is on that table that the woman he spent 5 years deciding was beneath him has just become the only person standing between him and the end of everything." Cho began to write. Outside, the city moved in its usual afternoon rhythm, traffic and light, and the ordinary urgency of people going places. The sky had finally committed to gray, and the first thin rain of the evening was beginning to move across the windows of the 32nd floor. Lucian came in at 4:30 with the look of a man carrying news. "He called," Lucian said. Isabella looked up. "Damien? 20 minutes ago. He didn't call you. He called me." Lucian set his phone on the table with the call log visible. He said, and I'm quoting this exactly, "Tell her I'll meet her wherever she wants. Tell her I know she has it. Tell her I'm listening." The room was still for a moment. Cho looked at Isabella. Isabella looked at Lucian's phone. The call had come in at 4:12, which meant Damien had known, or suspected, the shape of what she was building, and he had not called his lawyers or his remaining loyalists or the federal contact who had been feeding him information for 14 months. He had called Lucian. He had reached toward the one person he knew would relay a message to Isabella. He was asking for the meeting. Not demanding it, not threatening, asking. "Where do you want it?" Lucian said. Isabella thought about it for exactly 3 seconds. "His conference room," she said. "The one in the downtown office. His space." She pulled on her jacket. "Tomorrow morning, 8 o'clock. Him, Victor Wren, and Marcus Webb. Nobody else." "And on our side?" "Me," Isabella said. "Cho comes but waits downstairs. You're in the car." She picked up the envelope from the table and put it in her bag with everything else. "This is not a negotiation that requires backup." Lucian looked at her the way he had been looking at her for 11 days, with the expression of a man who had worked for her grandfather for 20 years and for her for 7 more, and was seeing for the first time the full measure of what both of those decades had produced. "You're going to walk into his building," he said. "Yes. Alone. Yes. With everything." "That's the only way it works," she said. "He needs to see that I'm not afraid of his space. He needs to understand that I never was." She checked her watch. "Tell him 8 o'clock. Tell him to have coffee. Tell him—" She paused for a moment, and something crossed her face that was almost a smile, cold at the edges and completely certain in the center. "Tell him I said he should have called." Lucian picked up his phone. Isabella walked to the window one more time. The rain was coming in properly now, the way it had come in 11 days ago. Sideways and deliberate, the kind of rain that does not apologize. The city below shimmered and fractured and went on being exactly what it was, indifferent and magnificent and full of people who had no idea that tomorrow morning, in a conference room on the 22nd floor of a building in the financial district, the most feared man in the city was going to sit down across from the woman he had dismissed, underestimated, manipulated, and ultimately underestimated again. And she was going to open a bag and put documents on a table and show him the precise and complete dimensions of the mistake he had been making for 5 years. She was not nervous. That was the thing she kept returning to. She had expected to be nervous, and she was not. She was tired. The specific, bone-deep tiredness of 11 days of no real sleep and permanent forward motion. And she was clear, and she was ready, in the way that you are ready when you have done everything that could be done, and what remains is simply to walk through the door. She reached into her bag and felt the edge of the envelope, felt the folded page from Soren, felt the worn edge of the blanket tucked underneath everything else, carried with her everywhere since the night she had picked it up from the ottoman and walked out of the house that was never hers. Tomorrow morning, she would walk into Damien Volkov's building and sit at his table and end the war he had started 14 months ago while pretending it hadn't begun. And the thing he did not know, the thing none of them knew yet, not Lucian, not Cho, not Victor Wren, not Marcus Webb, was that she had one more piece. One final document that Reina Solano had placed in the envelope without mentioning it, that Isabella had found when she went through the contents carefully at a rest stop on the highway back from Harlan's Creek, that she had sat in a parked car and read 3 times in the thin October light. A document that did not just change the shape of the federal case, a document that told her exactly who inside Damien's remaining network had been feeding him information about the investigation, the name of the federal contact who had been his protection for 14 months, a name she recognized, a name that would, when she placed it on the table tomorrow morning, make every other piece of documentation irrelevant by comparison, because it meant the entire structure of his protection was not just exposed. It was already in her hands, and he was walking into that meeting without knowing. He was walking into that meeting without knowing what she held. She let him. That was the decision she made at the window on the 32nd floor, with the rain coming down and Lucian on the phone behind her, and the city going about its evening like nothing in it was about to change. She let him walk toward tomorrow morning without warning, without preparation, without the specific advantage that knowing gives a careful man when he is about to sit across from someone who has more than he thought she did. She let him because she was tired of managing his understanding of her. That, she realized, was what the last 5 years had actually been, a continuous, exhausting management of what Damien Volkov was permitted to know about Isabella Vane. She had controlled the information, shaped the presentation, maintained the performance of smallness, and it had cost her something she could not fully name, but could feel in her body the way you feel old injuries in cold weather. A specific ache in the place where she had compressed herself to fit inside someone else's idea of who she should be. She was done managing it. Tomorrow, he would find out everything at once, and whatever happened after that would happen on honest ground. She slept 6 hours. In a bed this time, in the small room off the office that had been set up for exactly these occasions. She changed clothes in the morning. Dark jacket, dark trousers, the kind of clothing that said nothing and therefore said everything. She ate breakfast alone at the table, looking at the documents one final time, not because she needed to review them, but because she wanted to know them the way you know the weight of something before you lift it. She left the building at 7:40. The rain from the night before had cleaned the streets to a particular sharpness, that specific post-storm quality of air that makes colors look more accurate and distances look shorter. She walked the 4 blocks to Damien's building rather than taking the car. She wanted the air. She wanted to arrive on her own feet, under her own momentum, not delivered. The building on the corner of Breck and Hollander was 22 floors of glass and steel that presented itself to the world as the headquarters of Volkov Holdings, a legitimate real estate and investment firm with a respectable history, a clean website, and a board of directors that included 2 former city commissioners and 1 retired federal judge. The lobby was marble and understated, the kind of design that worked very hard to communicate stability. The woman at the reception desk recognized Isabella, which was interesting. She had never been to this building before. "Ms. Vane," the woman said, "Mr. Volkov is expecting you, 22nd floor." Isabella noted the name she had been given. Not Mrs. Volkov, not Isabella. Ms. Vane. Which meant Damien had prepared his staff for who was coming and had chosen deliberately how to have her announced. She took that as information. The elevator ride was 22 floors of silence, and her own reflection in the brushed steel door. She looked at herself the way she rarely did. Not checking, not adjusting, just looking. She looked like a woman who had not slept enough in 11 days. She looked like a woman who had walked through something and come out the other side changed in ways that did not show on the surface, but had rearranged everything underneath. She looked, she thought, like herself. Possibly for the first time in 5 years. The doors opened. Marcus Webb was in the hallway. He was standing near the conference room door with his hands clasped in front of him, and the careful expression of a man positioning himself as neutral. Not Damien's man, not Isabella's, just a professional in a room where things were about to happen and who intended to remain standing when they were over. He nodded at her. She nodded back. She pushed open the conference room door. Damien was already seated. He was at the head of the table, his table, in his building, his chair, the position of authority that he had occupied in every room he had ever entered because walking to any other seat would have been, for him, a physical impossibility. He was in a dark suit, no tie, the collar open in the way she recognized as his version of controlled informality. He looked like he had slept. He always looked like he had slept. That was one of his particular qualities, the ability to present a rested, composed exterior regardless of what was happening underneath. Victor Wren was to his right, 70 years old, hands on the table, face arranged in the neutral patience of a man who had seen negotiations of every variety and had long ago stopped letting them alter his expression. There was a third man at the table that Isabella had not expected. He was seated to Damien's left, slightly back from the table, in the posture of a man who is present but not leading. Late 40s, nondescript in the way that people who work in government-adjacent spaces often cultivate deliberately. The kind of person whose face you would not remember in a corridor. He was looking at his own hands when Isabella came in. She knew, before anyone spoke, who he was. The federal contact. The name from Raina's final document. His name was Paul Greer. He had worked for a congressional oversight subcommittee for 11 years before moving to a private advisory role that maintained his federal access through consulting arrangements. He had been Damien's protection inside the investigation for 14 months. He was in this room, which meant Damien had decided to stop hiding him, or had decided he had no choice. She set her bag on the table and sat down, not at the far end, directly across from Damien, close enough that there was no comfortable distance between them. "You brought him," she said, looking at Greer. "I brought him because you already know about him," Damien said. "Raina gave you everything." "She gave me what she had," Isabella said. "Which is enough," Damien said. Not bitterly, just accurately. The room was very still for a moment. Victor cleared his throat. "Perhaps we should—" "Let her," Damien said without looking away from Isabella. "She came here with something. Let her put it on the table." Isabella reached into her bag. She removed the documents in the order she had arranged them, not to be theatrical, but because the sequence mattered, because she wanted them to understand the architecture of it before they saw the whole structure. She placed the Castellano documentation first, the March session notes that Webb had referenced, that 3 years of careful management had been designed to contain. She placed them without comment and watched Victor's face and saw, in the slight movement at the corner of his jaw, the confirmation that he recognized what he was looking at. She placed Soren's financial analysis second. The 14 months of Elliot Vane's movements, the destination accounts, the Volkov holding structure that received the intelligence. She placed the Raina Solano materials third, the Halden arrangement, the federal case timeline, the documentation of what Claire Ash had brought to the task force and what that task force had been building toward for more than a year. And then she placed the last document, the one she had found at the rest stop on the highway back from Harlan's Creek, sitting in a parked car in thin October light. She placed it directly in front of Paul Greer. He looked at it. His face did not change in any dramatic way, but his breathing changed. She saw it in his chest, the slight alteration in its rhythm, the particular stillness of a person whose body has received information that the mind is still processing. His name was at the top of the document. His name and the specific communications he had passed to Damien's organization, and the dates and the financial arrangement that accompanied them. He was not just a contact, he was a participant. "That is a copy," Isabella said. "The original and 3 additional copies are with Bernard Cho, who is in this building's lobby right now. If I am not downstairs within 90 minutes, he has instructions." No one spoke. Damien looked at the documents on the table. He looked at all of them, one by one, in sequence, with the methodical attention of a man who is taking complete inventory of a situation he did not fully anticipate. His face was still. Not the performance of stillness, actually still. The stillness of a person who has arrived somewhere they knew they were going but had hoped to arrive at differently. "Elliot," he said finally. "Has been located," Isabella said. "He is cooperating with our legal team. His financial exposure and the trust interference is considerable and he is aware of it." A muscle moved in Damien's jaw. "I didn't know he was family." "You didn't ask," she said. "I knew the last name. I didn't know the connection to you." She looked at him. "That's what you want to lead with?" He looked back at her. Something in his eyes that she had not seen before, not in 5 years of marriage, not in the confrontation in her sitting room, not in the silence on the phone. Something that was not quite remorse and not quite defeat, but lived in the territory between them. The specific look of a man who has run out of the particular resource, certainty, that has always been his primary currency. "No," he said, "it's not." Victor shifted in his chair. Greer had not looked up from the document in front of him. "What do you want?" Damien said. "I want the legitimate businesses restructured under new oversight," Isabella said. "Webb has already outlined what's salvageable and what isn't. The salvageable portions support over 300 jobs across 4 operations. Those people deserve to keep working." She paused. "I want the Castellano arrangement formally unwound through your legal team in cooperation with counsel I designate. I want the documentation of the unwinding to be comprehensive enough that it closes the exposure for everyone who was peripheral to it and had no decision-making authority." "And Castellano himself?" Victor said. "That's a conversation for attorneys," Isabella said. "Not this table." Victor nodded. "Once." "Greer," Isabella said. The man to Damien's left finally looked up. You are going to make yourself available to Bernard Cho this afternoon, she said. What you do after that is between you and your own attorneys and whatever arrangement you're willing to reach with the task force. But the documentation I have makes your position untenable in its current form, and the question of whether this becomes something that takes down everyone around you or something that is managed narrowly is going to depend entirely on the decisions you make in the next 48 hours. Greer looked at her for a long moment. He was not an emotional man. His particular brand of government-adjacent professional had been trained out of visible emotion over a long career. But something moved across his face that was readable regardless. The specific expression of a person who has spent 14 months believing they were safely positioned between two forces and has just understood that the space they were standing in was not safe at all, and never had been. "All right," he said. The word was quiet, not broken, not theatrical, just a man landing on the one available surface. He stood up. He buttoned his jacket. He left the room without further conversation, and the door closed behind him, and then there were four of them: Isabella, Damien, Victor, and Webb, who had slipped in quietly at some point and was standing near the wall with his hands at his sides. The room was different with Greer gone. The specific tension of his presence, the federal dimension, the legal exposure, the 14 months of his particular betrayal had walked out with him, and what remained was quieter and more personal. Damien pushed back slightly from the table. He looked at the documents still spread across it. Everything Isabella had assembled, everything Reyna had given her, everything Soren had traced and Lucian had organized and Cho had prepared. He looked at it the way you look at a map that shows you, for the first time, the actual terrain of a place you believed you knew. "I need to ask you something," he said. "Ask. Did you know? When we got married, did you know what all of it was, and you married me anyway?" The question was genuine, not defensive, not strategic. The actual question of a man who has arrived at a moment where the performance is no longer affordable and what is left is just the real thing underneath it. She thought about how to answer it, not because she was unsure of the truth, but because the truth had layers and she wanted to give him the right one. "I knew enough," she said. "I didn't know the specific arrangements. I didn't know the extent of it, but I knew the shape of it, what you were connected to, what the organization was." She paused. "I married you because I thought the shape of a person was not the same as who they were. I thought the way you were built was not the same as what you were capable of becoming." He looked at the table. "You were wrong," he said. "I was wrong about the timeline," she said. "I'm not sure I was wrong about the capacity." He looked up at that. "That is not forgiveness," she said. "I want to be clear about that. It's a distinction. What you did, the manipulation, Elliot, the years of performing someone who underestimated me while actually watching me, that is not something I am going to reconcile. That is not something that gets explained away by acknowledging it." "I know," he said. "I am offering you a way through this that does not destroy everything," she said. "Not for you. For the people inside what you built who did not have the luxury of choosing what they were part of. For Marcus," she glanced at Webb, "and the 300 people in those operations, and the families attached to them." She put her hands flat on the table. "And because I refuse to become someone who uses what I have to cause maximum damage. That's not who I am. It was never who I was, regardless of what you thought you were dealing with." The room held that for a moment. Victor spoke. "What does cooperation look like, practically?" "Your attorneys meet with Cho today," Isabella said. "The restructuring timeline is 60 days. The Castellano unwinding is handled parallel. Damien steps back from operational authority in the legitimate businesses. Not publicly, not dramatically, no announcements that create instability. Internally, Webb assumes oversight under a new structure that I will have a designated seat on." She looked at Damien. "You remain as a minority stakeholder. You draw no operational salary. You consult if Webb determines your input has value." Victor looked at Damien. Damien was looking at Isabella. "A seat on the board," he said, "of what was my company. Of what is now a company that might survive," she said, "which is better than the alternative." The silence stretched. Webb, from his position by the wall, spoke for the first time. His voice was careful, practiced, the voice of a man choosing words like he is diffusing something. I want to say for the record that the operational structure she is describing is one I can work with. It is one I believe is genuinely viable. He paused. I've been trying to find a version of viable for 2 years. This is it. Damien looked at Webb. Something crossed his face that Isabella could not fully name. Something that had to do with loyalty and its limits and the particular pain of finding out that the people who have been most honest with you are the ones you have been least honest with. All right, Damien said. 2 words, the same 2 words Greer had used, but different in weight. Greer's had been surrender. Damien's was something more complicated. The sound of a man making the first unambiguous decision of his life that was not about power. Victor began making notes. Webb straightened up and took out his phone and stepped slightly out of the circle of the conversation to make the call that would start the legal process moving. And Damien and Isabella sat across from each other at the table, with the documents between them and the city outside, and the morning moving forward the way mornings do. He looked at her. I need to say something, he said, and I need you to let me say it without it being part of the negotiation. She waited. He looked at the table first, then up. You were extraordinary before I ever met you. I don't say that to make it better. I say it because it's true, and because I spent 5 years knowing some version of it, knowing you were more than what you showed me, and using that knowledge to maintain an advantage rather than actually looking at you. He stopped. Started again. I told you that you were nothing before me. I said that. His voice was flat, unadorned, not performing remorse. That is the ugliest thing I have ever said to another person. And I said it to someone who had done nothing to deserve it, who had loved me for 5 years without lying about it, which is more than I can say for anyone else in my life. Isabella looked at him. She let the words land where they were going to land, in the place in her chest that had been managing this particular wound for 11 days and for 5 years before that. She let them land and she felt them, and she did not look away. I know, she said, quietly. I'm not asking you to... I know, she said again. You're not asking. That's the first honest sentence you've completed in this room. He accepted that. They sat together in the silence of it for a moment. Not comfortably, but there was nothing comfortable about any of it, and there would not be for a long time, possibly ever. But honestly, in the specific way that honest silence feels different from every other kind, heavier and cleaner at once, like the air after the rain. Victor completed his notes. Webb finished his call. The room began to take on the quality of aftermath, the particular atmosphere of a space where something decisive has occurred and the people inside it are now beginning the separate private work of understanding what it means. Isabella gathered the documents from the table. She gathered them with care, the same care she had used to lay them out, because they mattered, and she had not stopped believing that things that mattered deserved care, even when the circumstances around them were brutal. She put them in her bag. She stood up. Damien did not stand. He sat in his chair at the head of his table in his building, with his hands in front of him on the table, and he watched her gather her things with an expression she had never seen on his face in 5 years of marriage. Open, undefended, the face of a man who has nothing left to project and has, perhaps for the first time, stopped trying. Isabella, he said. She stopped. I know the marriage is over, he said. I'm not trying to. He stopped again. The sentences were not coming easily. That too was new. I want to know that you're going to be all right. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about her mother, who had made the blanket in 3 winters and given it to her daughter because she understood that some things needed to be portable, that the things you carry with you mattered more than the things you built around yourself, because the things around you could be taken or changed or burned, but what you carried was yours. I've been all right, she said. I was all right before you. I was all right during. I am all right now. She picked up her bag. The difference is that now I don't have to make myself smaller to prove it. She walked to the door. She opened it. She stopped in the frame, back to the room, and she stood there for a moment in the particular way you stand when you are leaving something and understanding that you are leaving it. The coffee was good, she said. Not bitterly. Almost as if she meant it, which she did. There was something about the ordinary detail of it that felt necessary. A small true thing in the middle of everything large and heavy and definitive. She heard him exhale. A single, slow breath. She walked out. The hallway was quiet. Webb was near the elevator, phone still in hand, and he looked at her as she passed and gave her a single nod that contained something she received as respect, offered without flourish, one professional to another in the aftermath of something difficult. She pressed the elevator button. The ride down was 22 floors of silence and her own reflection again, and this time she did not look at herself differently than she had on the way up. She looked the same, which was the point, she thought. You do not look different after. You are different. It is all inside, all internal, the rearrangement of things. And the outside just goes on being the outside. The lobby, the marble. The woman at reception who did not say anything this time, just met her eyes briefly with an expression that was professionally neutral and possibly, underneath it, quietly witnessing. The glass doors. The street. Bernard Cho was on the sidewalk. Not in the lobby, as she had said, outside on the sidewalk, with his coat collar turned up against the morning chill and a paper coffee cup in one hand and the specific expression of a man who has been counting minutes. Webb's attorney is calling mine, she said. Already? Cho said. Already? She said. He nodded. He did not say anything for a moment. He looked at the building and then back at her. How did it go? She thought about how to answer that. The way things go when everyone in the room has run out of anything better to do than tell the truth, she said. Cho absorbed that. Greer? He'll be calling you within the hour, she said. Be ready for that conversation to go in several directions. I'm always ready, Cho said. She believed him. Lucian was parked half a block down. She could see the car from where she stood, dark, unremarkable, engine running. The same kind of car that had picked her up 11 days ago from the end of Damien's private road in the rain. She looked at the car and thought about how much had happened in 11 days. She thought about the way time works, how it moves at its ordinary pace regardless of what is occurring inside it, how the city around her had gone on at exactly the same rhythm during 11 days that had, for her, felt like a different order of time entirely, compressed and expanded simultaneously. The specific temporality of living through something you cannot pause or fast forward or revisit. She started walking toward the car. The morning was cold and clear-aired, the sun somewhere above the clouds making the light flat and even. She walked the half block, and Lucian got out of the car when he saw her coming and stood on the sidewalk and looked at her the way he had been looking at her for 11 days. It's done, he said. The first part is done, she said. The next part is the work. The restructuring. The restructuring, she said. The legal process, the Elliot situation, the Greer fallout. She reached the car and stopped beside it. None of that is easy. None of it is fast. No, Lucian agreed. But it's honest, she said, which means it's buildable. She got in the car. Lucian got in beside her and did not start driving immediately. He sat for a moment with his hands on the wheel, and she sat beside him with her bag in her lap and her mother's blanket inside it. And they sat there for a moment in the parked car while the city went about its morning around them, ordinary and indifferent and completely unaware. Your grandfather would have something to say about all of this, Lucian said. He would have said I should have activated 3 years earlier, Isabella said. Yes, Lucian said. He would have. He also would have said that the timing you choose is the timing you can sustain, she said, which is something he told me when I was 19 and which I have been thinking about for 11 days. Lucian looked at her. He said that to me too once, about 30 years ago. I know, she said. He told me he said it to you. Something moved across Lucian's face that was close to a smile, complicated by everything around it. He started the car. They drove. The city moved past the windows the way it always did, in pieces, in glimpses, in the specific accidental beauty of a place that does not know it is being looked at. A woman walking a dog on a corner, the dog pulling towards something invisible and important. Two men unloading a truck outside a restaurant, passing boxes with the easy economy of people who have done this particular thing together many times. A child in a yellow coat who stopped in the middle of the sidewalk to look at something on the ground and was gently redirected by the hand of an adult. Isabella watched all of it. She was very tired, the kind of tired that is not unpleasant, that specific exhaustion that comes on the other side of something, when the body understands that the crisis has passed, and it is permitted, finally, to stop running on whatever it had been running on. She thought about what came next. Not today. Today she knew. Today was attorneys and calls and the beginning of the 60-day restructuring and the long, careful process of untangling what could be untangled and letting the rest go. Today was defined. She knew exactly what today needed. She thought about what came next after the work, after the 60 days and the legal process and the Elliot situation and the Greer fallout and all of it. She thought about what she was going to do with herself when the crisis was no longer the organizing principle of her life. She had a company. She had built something carefully over 7 years, in silence and in patient increments. And it was real, and it was hers, and it was only now beginning to exist in the world openly. She had work she was good at, and that mattered, and that she had denied herself the full pleasure of for 5 years. She had herself. That was the thing she kept coming back to, the thing that was both simple and enormous. She had herself. Not a version of herself maintained for a context, not a smaller self designed to fit inside someone else's understanding, not the patient waiting self she had worn inside the Volkov estate for 5 years. Just herself. The car crossed the bridge over the river and the city shifted around them to the financial district and the building came into view and Lucian pulled into the parking structure and cut the engine. Neither of them moved for a moment. Reina Solano, Isabella said. I want to make sure she's protected. Whatever the Greer fallout looks like, whatever the federal process needs, she goes into it with full legal support. From us, at no cost to her. Whatever she needs. Done, Lucian said. And the 300 people in the legitimate operations, I want weekly reporting on where the restructuring stands and how the workforce is being affected. I don't want to find out in a summary. I want to know in real time. Done, he said again. She sat for another moment. Lucian, she said, the contact Elliot made 3 years ago, the one you shut down and didn't tell me about. He was very still. Don't do that again, she said. Ever. To me or to anything that touches what we're building. If someone contacts you about me, about my family, about my structure, you tell me, regardless of whether you've handled it. Regardless of whether you think it's relevant, you tell me. Yes, he said, without qualification, without defense. Good, she said. She opened the car door. The parking structure was quiet, cool, slightly echoey. The particular acoustics of concrete and low ceiling. She stood beside the car and slung her bag over her shoulder and breathed in the cold, faintly oily air of it. She thought about the night she had stood at the end of Damien's private road in the rain and called this man and said, activate everything. She had not known, standing there, what everything would look like when it was activated. She had known it needed to happen. She had known that the 5 years of waiting were over and that whatever came next was going to require her to become fully, publicly, unapologetically the person she had been quietly being in private for 7 years. She had not known it would cost this much. She would do it again. Not because the cost was acceptable. It wasn't, not fully, not the parts that had to do with the years she had spent and the things she had believed, and the specific grief of understanding that the shape of a person and who they are can be the same. After all, that some people are not waiting to become something different, they have already decided what they are. She would do it again because the alternative was remaining something she was not, in a space that was not hers, beside a version of herself she had constructed to survive a situation she should have walked out of sooner. She knew that now. She had known it in that sitting room standing over the table with the wedding ring in her hand before she had all the evidence and the documents and Reina Solano's envelope. She had known it in the 3 seconds she stood at the bottom of the staircase listening to the music from upstairs. She had known it longer than she admitted. She walked to the elevator. She rode it to the 32nd floor. She walked to her office, her real office, the one that looked out over the city she had been working in quietly for 7 years, while everyone in it assumed she was somewhere else being someone else's wife. She set her bag on the desk. She took out her mother's blanket and unfolded it and held it for a moment. The worn cream wool, the pattern her mother had invented in 3 long winters. The thing that had survived everything it had been asked to survive. She folded it differently this time. Not the compressed fold of something being carried, something being protected. She folded it the way you fold something you are putting somewhere it belongs. She placed it on the small chair in the corner of her office, the reading chair she had brought from the 32nd floor storage room on her second day here, the chair that had no resemblance at all to the one in the sitting room of the Volkov estate, except in the simple fact that it was hers. She sat down at the desk. She opened her laptop. She began to work. Outside, the city turned toward noon and then past it, the thin October light doing what it does in late October, beginning its early retreat toward evening. The streets filled and thinned and filled again with the normal traffic of people going about lives that had nothing to do with any of this. The rain did not come back. The sky stayed flat and pale and wide. Months later, people would begin to tell a different story about what had happened inside the Volkov organization. The restructuring, the new leadership, the quietly managed legal resolution that protected the workforce and closed the federal exposure without a public spectacle. They would tell it the way people tell stories about institutions that survived their own worst moments, attributing it to systems and structure and the anonymous force of good management. They would not always know her name. The ones who did, the attorneys, the investors, the people inside the legitimate businesses who kept their jobs and watched something corrupt become something functional. They knew. They knew that the woman who had walked into that building on a Tuesday morning with a bag full of documents and nothing left to manage or perform had changed the shape of something that had seemed unchangeable. They did not tell it as a triumph. That was not the right word for it. Triumph implies that something was won cleanly and that the winning felt good. What happened was not clean, and it did not feel good. Not exactly. It felt like surviving something that required you to be more than you knew you were, and discovering on the other side that being more had cost you certain things you would have preferred to keep. The marriage was over. The love, or what she had believed was love, or what had been love once before it became something else, was gone in the specific way that love goes when it has been used against itself. That kind of gone does not leave cleanly. It leaves residue. It leaves the particular ache of something that was real becoming evidence of a mistake. She did not pretend that did not matter. She did not pretend the 5 years were simply a chapter she had closed and walked away from without carrying anything out of it. She carried things out of it. She carried the knowledge of her own patience, which she had tested beyond any reasonable expectation and which had held, not because she was built to endure, but because she had chosen to continue past the point where most people would have stopped. She carried the understanding of what she was actually capable of, which turned out to be considerably more than she had permitted herself to access for 5 years. She carried her mother's blanket. She was at her desk when the call came in, 6 months after that Tuesday morning. It was Lucian, 3 floors below, his voice carrying the specific quality of someone relaying something they are not sure how to frame. "Damien called," Lucian said. She did not respond immediately. "He said to tell you the East Manufacturing Facility just turned its first clean quarterly profit since 2019. He said Webb thought you should know. He said—" Lucian paused. "He said he thought you should know too." She looked at the window, the city outside. The ordinary city, going about its afternoon with complete indifference to the fact that she was sitting in an office on the 32nd floor, carrying everything she carried. "Tell Webb congratulations," she said. "And Damien?" She thought about it. "Tell him I heard," she said. She ended the call. She sat at her desk in the quiet office with the blanket on the chair in the corner and the city outside the window and the work open in front of her, and she breathed in and breathed out, slowly, the way you breathe when you are on the other side of something and beginning, finally, the long and ordinary work of becoming whatever comes next. The quietest person in the room. That is what they had called her, in the beginning. In the early profiles and the features and the financial press coverage that had followed the emergence of Vayne's strategic partners, they had noted her years of discretion, her deliberate anonymity, the decade of building in silence before stepping into the light. They had noted it as unusual, as strategic, as the kind of discipline that produces a particular kind of power. They were not wrong, but they did not know the full version. The full version was that she had been quiet not only by strategy. She had been quiet because she was listening, because her mother had told her that the people who talk the most in a room are the people who are most afraid of what might be heard in the silence, and that the person with the patience to wait and hear everything is always, eventually, the person who understands the room most completely. She had listened for 5 years. She had heard everything. And then, one stormy October night, She had walked out into the rain and made a phone call, and the silence had ended, and everything she had been in the silence had stepped into the world and refused to be small any longer. That was the story. Not a victory, not a clean ending, not a lesson with a single clear moral and a bow on it. Just a woman who knew what she was worth, who waited longer than she should have to prove it to herself, and who, when the moment finally came, did not hesitate. She turned back to her desk. She worked until the light outside went entirely dark, and the city came on in its millions of small illuminations. And she kept working, and the chair with the blanket sat in the corner of her office holding its quiet warmth, and the door was closed against the hallway, and for the first time in a very long time, every single thing around her was exactly what it appeared to be, hers. Completely, honestly, undeniably hers.